1935. This was the year the B-17 first took to the sky. It was a massive four-engine heavy bomber built for one purpose: high-altitude strategic destruction. The United States military needed a machine that could carry thousands of pounds of explosives over thousands of miles. They built a monster. 13 machine guns. That was the defensive teeth of the aircraft. They bristled from every angle of the fuselage. It could absorb direct hits from cannons and stay in the air. This durability gave it a legendary name, the Flying Fortress. But why did the crews fear it? At first glance, a masterpiece of engineering. In reality, a cold, vibrating metal trap. Every mission was a gamble with death. The B-17 was designed to fly at 25,000 feet. At this height, the environment becomes an enemy. It was not just dangerous, it was a journey into a mechanical hell. The footage shows 10 men squeezed into a narrow aluminum tube. There was no insulation. There was no pressurized cabin. The temperature inside the plane dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Touching the metal skin with a bare hand meant instant frostbite. The skin would rip away. It got worse. Crew members wore heavy, electrically heated suits. If the wire snapped or the battery failed, the cold became lethal. Soldiers watched their own fingers turn black. They breathed through oxygen masks that often froze solid from the moisture in their breath. If the mask failed, the airmen had 2 minutes before losing consciousness. The sound was deafening. 4 Wright Cyclone engines roared constantly. Conversation was impossible. Men communicated through crackling headsets while the airframe shook violently from turbulence and nearby explosions. There was no mistake. The B-17 was a marvel of technology, but for the crew, it was a torture chamber. The aircraft was significantly larger and faster than its predecessors. Yet every second inside was a struggle for survival. Some positions in the plane were purely terrifying. The ball turret was the worst. It was a small glass bubble hanging from the belly of the bomber. One man sat curled in a fetal position, suspended over the abyss. He had no room for a parachute. If the landing gear jammed, he would be crushed against the runway. The mission profile was brutal. The B-17 was designed to cruise at heights where the air is too thin to support life. At these altitudes, German flak reached up to tear the wings off. Fighters dived from the sun to spray the cockpit with lead. Events accelerated. In 1943, the survival rate for a crew was less than 25%. They flew through clouds of jagged metal and fire. They watched neighboring planes disintegrate in mid-air. Immense courage was the only thing keeping the engines turning. These men paid a high price in blood and psychological trauma. They were teenagers flying a high-tech fortress that offered almost no protection from the elements or the enemy. The missions were nearly suicidal. Thus ended the era of the unpressurized bomber. 25,000 feet. That was the operational altitude for the B-17 Flying Fortress. The aircraft lacked a pressurized cabin. At this height, the atmosphere contains almost no oxygen. The crew survived only by wearing heavy rubber oxygen masks strapped to their faces. Temperatures inside the fuselage plummeted to minus 60 degrees. The cold was a physical enemy. To survive, every man wore an electric flying suit plugged into the aircraft's power grid. These suits functioned like heated blankets shaped into uniforms. If the suit failed, the cold took over. Onboard footage shows crews shivering violently in the uninsulated metal shell. The environment dictated the physics of survival. If a crew member was wounded by shrapnel, his blood did not always pool. It froze. The extreme cold turned liquid into ice as soon as it left the body. In some instances, this flash freezing acted as a natural tourniquet. It stopped the bleeding and saved lives. But the equipment was fragile. Wires snapped. Plugs fell out. When a suit malfunctioned, the result was severe frostbite within minutes. If the oxygen system failed, the danger was silent. Veterans recall watching crew members lose their air supply. The victim would not gasp or struggle. He would simply fall asleep. Without immediate intervention from a comrade, death followed in 5 minutes. Bare skin was a liability. The men wore thick gloves at all times. Touching any metal surface with a naked hand caused the skin to fuse to the aircraft. If the hand was pulled away, the skin peeled off entirely. Gunners faced the highest risk. Machine guns frequently jammed during high-altitude combat. To clear the mechanism, a gunner often had to remove his outer gloves to manipulate small parts. Many lost fingers to the metal. Frostbite was a constant, documented injury for nearly every crew. The B-17 was a stable platform, but it was slow. To survive, the Army Air Corps developed a specific tactic. They flew in tight combat boxes. Pilots kept their wings only feet apart from neighboring planes. Why fly so close? The answer was defensive firepower. This formation created overlapping fields of fire. It turned a group of bombers into a massive flying fortress of machine guns. No matter which angle an enemy fighter attacked from, it faced a wall of lead. The formation was the only shield they had. Getting into formation was the hardest part of the mission. B-17 crews feared this phase more than the target run. Dozens of heavy bombers had to take off in a rapid sequence. One plane reached the end of the runway. 30 seconds later, the next engine roared behind it. The danger was not theoretical. During training alone, 2,800 airmen died in mid-air collisions and takeoff accidents. This happened before they even reached the combat zone. The footage shows planes packed tightly in the clouds. At first glance, a disciplined fleet. But in reality, a wall of vibrating metal where one mistake meant total destruction. German air defense was the primary threat. Anti-aircraft batteries and interceptor pilots specialized in tearing these formations apart. Many B-17s never returned to base. The most famous weapon in the German arsenal was the 88mm flak cannon. It was precise, it was destructive. Was the 88 just for planes? No, it was a dual-purpose weapon used with deadly effect against heavy tanks on the ground. But in the sky, its range was the true terror. These guns fired shells to altitudes of 30,000 feet. This was the exact cruising altitude of the B-17 Flying Fortress. The Germans didn't scatter these guns randomly. They concentrated hundreds of batteries around high-value targets, large factories, logistics hubs, major cities. Flak shells did not need to hit the plane to kill the crew. They were fused to explode at a specific height. When the timer hit 0, the shell burst. It scattered jagged metal shrapnel in a massive radius. The B-17 was built from thin aluminum. A direct hit vaporized the airframe. But even a near miss sent red-hot fragments through the fuselage. There was no armor to stop them. Events accelerated once the formation entered the flak zone. There was no turning back. 88mm shells exploded in the air. These near misses were not harmless. Shrapnel punctured aluminum fuselages, shredded wing flaps, and severed hydraulic lines. One jagged piece of metal could kill a pilot instantly or disable a control surface. The psychological pressure was constant. Crews flew into black clouds of smoke without knowing if the next second was their last. The view from the cockpit was grim. Airmen watched neighboring planes take direct hits. Some fell out of formation in a slow spiral. Others vanished in a ball of fire when a shell ignited the fuel tanks or the bomb bay. The footage shows a common sight: a B-17 disintegrating with no parachutes in the air. 10 men gone in an instant. Every survivor wondered if their tail number was next. But flak was only the first layer of the trap. A greater danger waited above the clouds. German radar stations tracked every movement. They directed Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 interceptors toward the bomber streams. The Luftwaffe scrambled hundreds of planes to meet the formation. They did not attack at random. They moved in coordinated waves. German pilots preferred the head-on attack. They flew directly at the nose of the B-17 at a closing speed of 500 miles per hour. This targeted the unarmored glass of the cockpit and the exposed engines. They also exploited blind spots from the rear and sides. The German fighters carried 20mm and 30mm cannons. A single hit from these shells could blow a wing off. The Allies made a fatal assumption. They believed the 13 machine guns on a B-17 made it a flying fortress that needed no help. They were wrong. The heavy bombers were slow and vulnerable. During the first years of the war, the escort fighters had a limited reach. Spitfires and P-47s had to turn back when their fuel ran low. The bombers were left alone over deep enemy territory. This changed only with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. These long-range fighters could fly all the way to Berlin and back. Only then did the casualty rates begin to drop. The air war was a game of numbers, and for a long time, the numbers favored the German interceptors. 10 men crammed into a fuselage of cold aluminum. This was the crew of a B-17 Flying Fortress. The interior was a narrow metal tube. Low ceilings forced grown men to crawl on their hands and knees to reach their stations. Every man wore a bulky flight suit, an oxygen mask, a heavy flak vest, and a helmet. A parachute harness was strapped over everything. Movement was difficult. Survival was unlikely. The numbers tell the story. The average age of these men was 24. Statistically, their mortality rate reached 20%. This was 50 times higher than infantry units in Europe. It was 10 times higher than troops fighting in the Pacific. How did they endure these conditions? There was no other choice. Only the mission mattered. At the very rear sat the tail gunner. He was the primary defense against attacks from behind. His seat was nothing more than a sawed-off bicycle saddle. He spent hours in a half-kneeling position within a cramped glass bubble. There was barely enough room to move his arms. But the waist gunner had it worse. 2 men stood midship, operating twin 50 caliber machine guns. The footage from the era shows the reality. They had no seats. They stood or leaned against their weapons for hours. The waist windows were wide-open gaps in the fuselage to provide a clear field of fire. The wind was a physical blow. The cold was brutal. Temperatures at high altitudes dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Touching bare metal meant instant frostbite. At first glance, they were protected by the plane. But in reality, they had almost zero armor against enemy fire. Only a thin layer of aluminum stood between them and German cannon shells. Danger didn't only come from the enemy. If the landing gear failed or a mid-air collision occurred, the fuselage would crumple like a tin can. The waist gunners were positioned exactly where the airframe was most likely to snap. They could be crushed to death in seconds. The sound of the wind was deafening. But what happened when the shells actually hit? The damage was immediate. When a B-17 was struck, the cabin filled with smoke and the smell of hydraulic fluid. Gravity became an enemy. If the plane entered a spiral, the centrifugal force pinned the crew against the walls. They couldn't reach the hatches. They couldn't reach their chutes. One hit changed everything. The story of the B-17 is a story of these 10 men. 2 gunners manned the top and ball turrets. Both operated twin 50 caliber machine guns. The top turret sat directly behind the cockpit. It offered a 360-degree field of vision. This made the gunner a clear silhouette against the sky. Enemy pilots saw him first. He was the primary target for every incoming fighter. The ball turret was different. It hung from the belly of the B-17. The gunner sat inside a cramped metal sphere. He was physically isolated from the rest of the 10-man crew. There was no room for a parachute inside the ball. He left his gear in the main fuselage. If the plane caught fire, his lifeline was out of reach. Space was at a premium. The turret relied on hydraulic fluid to rotate. To exit, the gunner had to align the hatch perfectly with the aircraft floor. This only worked in 2 specific positions. If the hydraulics failed, the mechanism locked. The hatch stayed shut. The footage shows the reality of a hit. When engines failed or wings folded, the centrifugal force pinned the gunner against the glass. He could not move. He could not reach the hand cranks. He watched the ground rush toward him from his plexiglass bubble. Many stayed trapped until the moment of impact. Others burned alive while the crew looked on from above. There was no mistake. It was the most dangerous seat in the sky. Landing gear failures created a different nightmare. If the wheels did not lock, the plane landed on its belly. The ball turret was the lowest point of the aircraft. If the gunner was trapped inside, the weight of 30,000 pounds crushed the turret instantly. The metal sphere flattened. The gunner was smeared across the concrete runway. This happened more than once. But these gunners did not fly alone. The B-17 Flying Fortress required a full team. A pilot and co-pilot held the controls. A navigator tracked the course. A bombardier handled the optics. A radio operator maintained the link to the ground. 10 men, 1 machine. Total synchronization. Thus, the mission continued. Anti-aircraft fire strikes the hull. Shrapnel tears through the fuselage. This was the moment every crew member feared. What happens after a direct hit? The pilots have seconds to react. They check the gauges and test the controls. Smoke fills the cockpit. If the plane still responds, the choice is simple. They stay with the machine. The goal is to reach a friendly airfield or a safe stretch of coastline. The B-17 and B-24 were heavy bombers. They were designed for durability, but they had limits. Some pilots managed the impossible. They crossed hundreds of miles of ocean with 2 engines dead and the wings riddled with holes. This was a mechanical miracle. The aircraft was not designed to stay airborne under these conditions. But often, the damage was too severe. The engines failed. The hydraulics died. The pilot gave the order to bail out. There was no time for panic. Crewmen grabbed their parachute packs and clipped them to their chest. They pushed each other toward the hatches and open bomb bays. If a man was wounded, his comrades dragged him to the exit. Where did they land? That was the next gamble. Falling over enemy territory meant immediate capture. In the Pacific Theater, this was a death sentence. Imperial Japanese forces did not follow the Geneva Convention. Airmen faced torture, starvation, and execution. Very few survived the camps. The sea was no safer. The Pacific Ocean is vast and cold. A downed flyer could inflate a small rubber raft, but he was a speck in the waves. Rescue planes searched the coordinates, but the success rate was low. If the rescue boats didn't arrive within hours, sharks or dehydration finished the job. Sometimes there was no chance to jump. A shell hits the fuel tank. The plane becomes a fireball in midair. Or the bomb load detonates inside the bay. The aircraft disintegrates instantly. In these cases, the crew dies before they can even reach for their chutes. The footage shows planes spinning out of control, wings breaking off under the G-force. Events moved fast in the sky. 1 minute a man was eating a ration tin. The next, he was fighting for air in the freezing slipstream. These missions demanded a specific type of courage. The war in the air ended in 1945.